I'm just going to tell you my story, which is a little unique, and I think it's sort of Chautauqua-esque in terms of the twists and turns that I took, and how my book came to be, and kind of thing, how I got here standing before you. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, not too far away really, as things go. There's people here from Arizona, so I'm pretty close. And I grew up watching the Big Red Machine. My mother's friend's mother was my primary caregiver as a kid. Maybe some might call her a nanny, but she was my Annie Mary to me. And she was a Big Red Machine. She was a big Reds fan. Games were always on the radio. Her older sisters would take me to games. And I grew up watching it, and the Big Red Machine was fantastic. It's a good time to fall in love with baseball. They were easy to love, I think. Yeah, exactly. So that was part of my thing. And the one thing about, I remember great moments. I remember Pete Rose diving into first base and scraping the skin off of his scabs and all of that stuff. I remember Dave Concepcion, who was an amazing, amazing defensive player. But the other thing I really took away from it, and going back to constantly, is the happiest I ever saw an adult as a child was when the Reds won. Midwesterners are pretty stoic people. They're not really quick to show emotion, and yet when the Reds won, there was joy. It was pure glee in a way. I went to Smith College, graduated, moved around, did load-ins for rock concerts, did opera summer stock in southern New Jersey, did all kinds of different things. I was a lighting and sound person and a stage manager type, not a person in front of the camera. I was very careful never to be in front of the camera. Standing up here would have been very daunting in those days, actually. So I graduated, moved around, did all of this, eventually ended up at Juilliard, and during my time at Juilliard, I ended up getting divorced. And while I was going through that time, I was struggling. All my peers had just gotten married and were having babies, so here I was, the single woman, and sort of the odd man out. And I discovered one weekend in the middle of the summer that the Reds were in town at Shea Stadium. So I decided on Friday afternoon I'd go to batting practice. And I hadn't done that since I was a young girl, but I'd go to batting practice by myself. And I walked in, and Ken Griffey Sr., who had been part of the Reds when I was a kid, was a bench coach, and he was standing there on the field. They weren't taking batting practice, there was a tarp on the field, but he was talking to Marty Brenneman, who happened to be the voice of the Reds when I was growing up, and still to this day is a Hall of Fame broadcaster. And all of a sudden, I remembered what it felt like to see them standing on the field. And I got sort of like a safe, joyous feeling about that. So I ended up buying season tickets to Shea, started going to more games, really immersed myself in it. Still was at Juilliard, and I was working 70 hours a week, burning out very quickly, but not enough time to figure out what I was going to do next. And September 11th happened. And that's one of those moments where, you kind of go, life's too short to be miserable. Like, you got to start checking those things off the list that you always wanted to do. I was fresh, sort of newly divorced, all of that, and I decided I was in a production a few days, a technical rehearsal, a few days after September 11th, and we were all given the mandate to try to make things as normal as possible for the students, which is, of course, what we would hope your professors and everybody would want to do for our students when they're in college. And I was in a rehearsal, and I had bought a plug that needed to be inserted into the floor, and so an actor could come on stage, put his lamp down, and plug the light in one quick motion, and the light would turn on. And the plug that we had, I brought up to install, turned out to be the wrong size, didn't fit, so I had to go tell the director, and the director started chewing me out about how this was so unfair, blah, 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 blah. And at that moment, this is 6 days after September 11th, and I just sort of went, this isn't important. I can't, you're ridiculous, and I can't care, and I can't do this anymore. So very quickly, I told my bosses that I was going to leave at the end of the season. This was my last season. I didn't know what I was doing next. I was going to figure it out when I was done. And I decided pretty quickly that I was going to go to every Major League Baseball stadium while I was figuring this out. At the time, Major League Baseball was talking about contracting 2 teams. For those of you who don't know, there's 30 Major League Baseball teams, and this was back in 2001, 2002. They had to negotiate in order to get rid of 2 teams. There were 2 teams that weren't thriving. One was the Montreal Expos. Who the second team was up for debate. And I wanted to do this thing where I went to all the stadiums. Well, there were 30 teams, not 28. So I had to get moving. And why could baseball survive in Toronto and not Montreal? And why could it thrive in St. Louis but not Kansas City? And so I decided I was going to write this book. I was going to go in and ask fans what their experiences were. And I set off on this journey, and I did basically just that. And I ended up staying where visiting teams stayed, so I got to see the players' life. And, you know, I got to see some amazing things. I got to see what it's like to John Smoltz and Tom Glavine sitting with their wives in Colorado Hotel after a game, having dinner, and having fans, one after the other, walk up and go, will you sign this? Excuse me, would you sign this? Excuse me, would you sign this? One after the other. And having them to have to say, I'm sorry, I'm with my wife, I'm with my family. Can you know, I'll sign tomorrow morning. If you're down here for coffee, I'll be happy to sign. And I saw that life. I went into stadiums and I talked with fans, and I got to hear the stories about people who went to the game with their dad and saw Roberto Clemente play, or Mickey Mantle play, or fell in love Pete Rose play, you know, and share those things. And it's that dialogue that happens among fans that players never get to see. And it's that learning about baseball from your father, from your grandfather, that I find sort of inspiring about baseball. It's that connecting. And maybe it's part of because I did this right after September 11th, but it's when that sense of how we connect to one another and what brings us together in communities, you know, particularly with all these online ways to connect and all these disconnects, you know, social media and all these things that in theory bring us together, but not in human contact. It's this way that you sit at a ball game and perhaps sit down next to Greg Peterson and have a conversation that brings you to have an opportunity to speak, or just hearing a story about a player that you never got to see, or, you know, hearing what the game means that I love. And so I sort of carved out a little niche. I write, my website is, the idea is to sort of give fans a better understanding of the life of baseball, about baseball players, and all the workings of it. So educating fans so they understand why their favorite player was traded away. Or I saw that Alan Schwartz's piece is one of the things on the class docket. It's that sort of understanding of that. You may not understand it up here, but understanding it here is a different thing. But I also then decided that I was going to try to work with baseball players themselves, coaching them on how to, what's turned it into making them marketable. That's the selling point, making them marketable. But it's really bridging that gap back to fans who have gotten sort of pushed back, don't get that connection, because the guys who out there, they never went to baseball games. They were playing baseball. So they didn't ever sit in the stands with their fathers and hear about Roberto Clemente or that sort of thing. They know it from books, they know it because their coaches told them, but they don't have that sense of community gained from that. So I spend a lot of time with them talking about that, creating opportunities in their schedule, teaching them how important that is for them to get to know him. You know, it could be the 25th man. They get kept because the fans love them. You know, I don't know if there's Mets fans here. Joe McEwing is a great example of a guy who they just kept him back. They could have found another guy, but they kept him because the fans loved him. You know, Barry Larkin is a Reds example, who he wanted $2 million to play one more season. They only wanted to give him $1.5 million, and he said, all right, I'll retire. And the fans wrote in and like 25,000 emails, phone calls from fans saying, you have to give Barry Larkin this extra money for one more year. And so they went back to the table, and he ended up getting like $2.4 million or something like that for his last year playing. So it can mean a lot to them in terms of that, but it means a lot more to fans who may just shake their hand or you know, have that little moment of interaction and stick with them. So that's where I've managed to carve out a little niche. Kind of what my book is about. I have a trivia question that we can all work on. There are 14 players in Major League history whose last names are 4 letters or less, who have hit 40 home runs or more in a season.
Oh my God.
Okay, it's a little complicated. I also have postcards for the website, which have trivia questions related to those teams.
Do you have a favorite ballpark?
PNC, without a doubt.
Is that right?
It's stunning. If you see, it's actually also the one on the front of the book.